the Social Sciences Department's Democracy Executed series. I want to welcome our three speakers today. Without further ado, who's starting right now? Professor Hampton will be going.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Good afternoon. For those of you who don't have me, I am Professor Hampton out of the Ethnic Studies Department. And we are going to be talking about what it says, right? Beyond Borders, the Myth of Immigration on Stolen Land. So understanding the history of stolen land in the U.S. And so I want to ask you a question right now. Just by show of hands, my students know, but just by show of hands, do we know what indigenous land we are currently on? Just raise your hand. Don't be shy, just raise your hand. Okay. And it's okay if you don't know, right? It's fine if you don't know, right? That is why we are here, okay? And so something I thought about that I thought was really important when I knew that we were going to have this talk was a book that I read to prepare for my classes. The book was An Indigenous People's History of the United States by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz. And the quote, I'm going to read it. So while I'm reading it, just think about it. Think about how you interact with it. And it's under the crust of the part of the earth called the United States of America are buried the bones, villages, fields, and sacred objects of the first people of the land. The people who are often called American Indians or Native Americans. Their descendants, also called indigenous people, carry memories and stories of how the United States came to be the nation we know today. It is important to learn and know this history, but many people today lack that knowledge and understanding because of the way America's history has been taught. And so I just want you to think about this in the context, right, of what you learned in your K through 12 education, right? Did you learn about Native Americans in a positive way? Did you learn that we were on land that belonged to Native Americans? Did you learn any of that in your K through 12 education? Just want you to think about that as we go. And so some things to consider. While we're going over these topics, I want you to mainly consider who gets to claim land and why. When we think of ownership, right, what do we think of? How do we know someone owns something? Anybody? How do we know someone owns something? Because they said it? Because they have a paper to show that they own it? Just think about it. And then what does it mean, right, to live on stolen land? We're going to talk about land acknowledgement. We're going to talk about supporting indigenous-led initiatives. And then the thing that I talk to my students about all the time, because I teach ethnic studies, decolonization, right? We know colonization happened. We, as people, have to understand, how do we decolonize? How do we get out of that? Right? On you? Yes.
A little tech switch here. Thank you again for being here. My name is Martha Peterson, and I teach history here. I focus on history of the United States and then also on American women's history. But I'm happy to be here today. I'm just going to talk about starting off with what are we going to be doing today? I want us to start thinking about with history, so I'm going to add that historical element to it. I want you to consider that history should matter to you very much, to you as an individual, to where we are today. Clearly, we're going through a lot of things within our nation. We are a very divided nation right now. There's a lot of discussions, a lot of disagreements on things. And I want you to start to think, one of the reasons why we're doing this is so that you can start thinking more deeply about these issues. A lot of the discussions, I think, are usually superficial, right? They're on the surface. We're talking about the symptoms. And I want us to start thinking about the root causes of things. We all want to see improvements. We all want to see things get better. We have different ideas of what that looks like. The best way to do that is to be able to look at root causes and not just the symptoms. Okay. So think about that as we go through today's presentation. So we're going to be talking about stolen land. I think some of us probably have learned about this, have started doing our own, work and reading about this. For others might be that's harsh. What do you mean stolen? Who stole what? Who stole what land? So the term really refers to that historical and ongoing, because it is ongoing, displacement of indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. So we're going to dig into that and find out what that's about. Why is the idea of immigration complicated on indigenous land? We're going to be examining that, right? Again, one of the issues that we're talking about now is issues of immigration, issues of mass deportation. Again, next week we'll be talking about mass deportation. But what does that mean? As Professor Hampton was talking about, it's who gets to claim land, who's going to get to say who belongs and who doesn't belong. We'll start to scratch the surface on that. And I just want to say we have 1 hour. So if you leave this room with a lot of questions, I feel that we are successful. That is the point, is we want you to start thinking about these things more critically and more deeply. So we're going to be touching on things. We're not going to go as deep, because any one of these things we could spend several days on, right? But we all want you to like start thinking about these things more deeply, and then consider them, and hopefully maybe start reading on some of the things that pique your interest. The U.S. was founded on settler colonialism. We'll talk about that, making all non-Indigenous people settlers in some way. So again, unless you're an Indigenous person, then you're basically a settler, right? You are come from another place. Overview of what we'll discuss: Indigenous presence before colonization, land theft through colonization and expansion, the impact of U.S. policies on Indigenous communities, and then rethinking the narrative of borders and immigrations. You want to go to the next one? I have notes just because I tend to ramble and go off on, so I might be looking at my notes a little bit. It was just to keep me on track. But we wanted to start off with this map. And does anybody want to tell us like what area this is? What are we looking at when we look at this map? I know it's like so simple that it's like, I don't want to say, it's too simple, right? Or maybe it's not. Maybe it's like, that looks funky. What is that? The United States, right? Thank you very much. So this is the land that eventually becomes the United States. We are accustomed to seeing it with the borders, with the Mexico border, the Canada border, and then all the states. So we want to start off by, again, thinking about how we're socialized and we're conditioned to accept things as they are, as if they've always been that way. And we want to point out that they have not always been that way, right? So this map actually is about some of the major Indigenous groups. So think about what it could have looked like before we create the state borders and the Canada and the Mexico border. I also want you to think about like the diversity. This is, we won't go into this too much, but that diversity of the people who were here, because we will say Indigenous people and we'll generalize and that sort of stuff, but it was a diverse group of people. And again, it doesn't get cut off where we talk about the southern border now, right? These people, it's fluid, it's movement. So just think about that. So one of the things is like the images. We want you to think about like stepping out of what we find to be sort of our norm, right? So then eventually we do have borders. How are borders created? What are borders for? They are constructs. So again, this is not something that is natural to the land. It is not something that is because it's just has to be that way. They are constructed over time. A lot of the time they're constructed through a lot of violence. Right. And that's one of the things that we also want to have you keep in mind. How do they function? For what reasons do they function? They function as mechanisms of control. What do I mean by that? Like harsh words, right? Mechanisms of control. Who belongs in what area, right? Don't our borders say? Are you a resident of California? Are you a resident of New York? Do you have a California driver's license? Do you have a Texas ID? And then when we're thinking internationally, who belongs, right? Or who doesn't belong, which is major. Who gets excluded? Who can we exclude? The other thing, it shapes racialized ideas of citizenship and national identity, which I'll be talking about in a few slides, because the ideas do become racialized when we're talking about who belongs and who does not belong. They shape also regional and personal identities. Do you think that's true? That they shape identities? Do you think the borders have the borders ever meant anything to you? What does it mean is it the same thing to feel like being a Californian than it is to be a Texan? Is it different to be somebody from the southern states or somebody to be from New York? It's different, right? Like we do, like you meet somebody's like, where are you from? Did you grow up in LA? Like the borders also define who we are, right? So think about how important these borders are. Some of the historical context, again, I'll just briefly kind of talk about a few things. The early colonial period, it's fluid, right? Once people are starting to come from Europe, it's going to start to change the folks that are here and the territories that are here already. In 1783, we have the Treaty of Paris. The Treaty of Paris is the peace agreement that ends the American Revolutionary War. At that point, we really set the territorial boundaries of what becomes the United States. So we have the British colonies. We do have other empires here too. Spain's here, France is here, right? The British are the ones who set those first colonies. Those colonies will eventually become states. And then after the American Revolutionary War, we define what those territories are. And then they're actually, during that point, it expands the territory, further displacing the indigenous people who have been here. So again, another thing you might want to look at on your own time is what that displacement looks like. I'm not going to talk about it so much here, but what that displacement looks like through violence, through disease, through other things. Assimilation we'll talk about a little bit. Later on, we're going to have other things that change the territory. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 gives us a big section of, starts to have us move westward. Then in 1848, we have the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Are you all familiar with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? How many of you are familiar with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo? Okay, good. And I love it. I love when people are like, I don't know, I'm not familiar, or I kind of heard of it. I love it because it means, cool, you're going to learn something, right? And again, even if it's just that surface level, hopefully you can dig in and like find out, what does that mean? Why does it matter? The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo ends the Mexican-American War. And most of what is now like the southwestern United States is gained from that treaty. Right? So think about what that means. First of all, we have indigenous people here. Spain is also colonizing. So then you have indigenous people who are colonized by Spain, colonized by the British. Especially with Spain, they're going to be intermixing with people. Eventually you have Mexican people, right? They've been here for generations and generations and generations. But what happens in the territory, but what happens with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo is now the border changed. Have you ever heard that joke? We didn't cross the border crossed us. And that's basically what happens. For generations, we had been in this territory, but all of a sudden the territory's changed. It goes back to the question you were asking, like, who gets to own, right? So now those people who had been here are also, well, now you're on American territory and now you're an outsider. Yeah, I get it. You've been here for generations and a lot of Mexicans have indigenous blood, but now you're not white. You are, don't speak English. You're the outsider in the territory that you had been for generations. Eventually, too, we have the development. We're getting more territory. We have the development of the border, or the territories to gain statehood, and now we have the development of the state borders. Oftentimes, those are going to be shaped by following rivers and following surveyed lines. Again, that's a very American thing. Indigenous people here, they weren't surveying and being like, there's my land, you stay over there, because indigenous people didn't view in owning the land in the same way that later Americans will own land. They are part of the land. And yes, they have the areas where they're living in, but again, it's fluid and they're not owning the land. So that will change. So anyway, we have the development of the state borders also at that point. And again, all of these things that are happening is ignoring and displacing indigenous people who are the original inhabitants of this land. Okay, I think we could go to the next one.
So indigenous nations before colonization. So we'll talk about a few, right? And so I asked you all, what land are we currently on, right? What indigenous land are we on? And some of you raised your hand. Does anybody want to say what that land is? Go ahead. Okay. Yes, but what indigenous nation? Tongva. Yes. So there's a building here, right, that we've seen. I don't know if students have classes in there because I've never been over there. But yes, I know. I'm sorry. I'm always in my other, what I'm saying too. So that is the land that we are currently on, right? And so when anybody asks you that question again, now you know. Everybody's hands should be raised. And so the three nations that we're going to talk about where indigenous people have lived on the land thousands of years, right? With sophisticated societies, governances, and trade networks. So Kahakoa, right? Which we know is Mississippi Valley, was a place that was big on politics, right, and economic system. Haudenosaunee, I think I said it right. I tried to say it like 15 times before I came. Which is northeastern U.S., right? Was big on creating our U.S. Constitution, right? The way that they operated, the way that they created, is something that helps create the U.S. Constitution. And then the Pueblos people, right? This irrigation and architecture, right, of what we know today. So again, these are nations that were here way thousands of years, right, before colonization. And so this is another map, right, because we love maps, that really broke down the nations, right, before European arrival. And again, we know this to be U.S., but you see the different nations that are constructed here.
Good afternoon, everyone. Professor Alex Williams, Anthropology. Appreciate you all coming out to learn about this very important topic. And what we're going to switch to now is a discussion of colonization and land theft. And we can move on to the next slide there. So imagine yourself being put in a situation where you are forced to abandon the land you grew up in and all of your cultural practices. Just sit with that for a second. Imagine that scenario, whatever your culture is, right? And all the practices and all the rituals and everything that's associated with it. You're actually not asked. You're made to abandon all of that and you're made to leave. What is that going to do for you emotionally, psychologically, and in various ways? What's that experience going to be like for you and your family? So if we talk about land theft, this is the experience that Native peoples living in these lands, as Professor Peterson and Professor Hampton talked about, dealt with, right? Not just them, members of their family, their community. Here's how it happened. There was a papal decree, and what it did was it gave Christian European nations the right to claim non-Christian lands. It was kind of this, they're heathens, so we're authorized to take their land because they don't deserve it. They don't know what to do with it anyways mentality, right? So European settlers arrived and they began displacing indigenous nations through military force, through conflicts such as King Philip's War and the Pequot War. Disease ran rampant. Measles, smallpox, the flu, right? Influenza. It wiped out a large portion of people. They weren't acclimated to these diseases. These things didn't exist here, right? They were brought over and the immune systems weren't prepared and weren't ready to withstand them. Also, there were many broken promises in the form of broken treaties, agreements between indigenous nations and the US government. Many were made, many were ignored, and some outright violated. Couple of pivotal events in this time. One is the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Basically happened is tribes were forced to relocate from the Southeast to the Midwest. As you saw on the map that was just up here, if you recall, the Cherokee Nation was located in eastern North Carolina. These people are forced to walk all the way from eastern North Carolina to Oklahoma, right? Forced to make this walk. That's an example of the forced relocation that happened during this time, which is why it's called the Trail of Tears. The Dawes Act of 1887, what it did was it broke up communal land holdings and it assigned plots to individuals, leading to the loss of millions of acres of land, right? And again, all of this is justified by this belief of they are savages, they are less than us, they are less civilized. We are civilized, we are enlightened, we are Christian people, they are heathens. Therefore, what we're doing actually isn't wrong. What we're doing is our right. It is something that we are entitled to do. Now, as anthropologists, we've studied, again, taking it back to the first scenario that I left you guys to ponder, right? What that might do to the individual and to a community. We study that as anthropologists. How did that affect culture? How does it affect culture when you're forced from your lands and you're forced to abandon your practices, your customs, your rituals, your dances, your language, all of that kind of stuff? One thing it does, it disrupts traditional lifeways, okay? You lose access to sacred sites. You lose access to traditional hunting and fishing grounds and to resources. For Native people, sacred sites were extremely, extremely important. And I don't want to generalize, right? Various different Native peoples living in this region, each with their own very unique traditions and belief systems and things of that nature. But in the general sense, there's this concept known as the concept of place, where place is endowed with meaning. For example, on a native, I believe it could be mistaken. I believe it's the Apache people. It could be mistaken. For the Apache people, each land form or item, it could be a hill, it could be a small tree, a mountain, whatever it is. These things aren't just a small hill, a mountain, a tree, whatever. It's the place where this happened. It's the place where my grandmother taught me this story about life on this mountain right here. Or at this tree, an elder gave me advice regarding this, or this mythical event happened in this mesa over here. So it's not just about being removed from places in the sense that we might relate to places living in America. A tree is just a tree, right? The 405 freeway is just a 405 freeway, right? We don't want to be on it longer than we have to be on it, right? There's nothing too special about it. But again, for Native people, many places had a sacred meaning or had a meaning that was associated with a story from an elder, an event in their cosmology that happened there. These places reminded them of things. And that was the reason why elders went through the lengths that they did to pass down the tradition, again, of place and meaning associated with it. So that when a younger person, again, looked at something, they would be reminded of, oh, that's the lesson that my elder taught me as I look at this. So when you're removed from these places and you're asked to leave and go a great distance and relocate somewhere else, you're now in a place that has no meaning to you. You're now in a place that has been stripped of that meaning, and very important pieces and elements of your culture have been lost. So it's bigger than just being asked to leave a place. What happened here? It disrupted traditional lifeways. That's what it did. It also eroded language and it eroded cultural practices. We're going to talk about this more so later on. Boarding schools were established, right, where folks were basically asked to leave their culture at the door. Okay. Traditional governance systems were often replaced and undermined by the US government. These people had ways of governing themselves prior to the imposition of US governmental ways of doing that they were asked to, in many regards, abandon. And again, rituals, dances, ceremonies, these were things that were either restricted or downright outlawed. So again, imagine what that might do to a person or to a community when that's the case. And so that's essentially what this doctrine of discovery, which kicked off in 1493, what the snowball effect of that basically led to, the abandonment of all of these forms of culture that held so much meaning to people.
And so, as all of these things, right, I want us to understand that um, this all came from an idea, a belief, right? And that belief being manifest destiny. The belief that white settlers were divinely destined to expand across North America. When we think about the word divinely, what do we think of? Is that a positive negative connotation or is that a negative connotation? Get a positive feel from that or a negative? From divinely. Positive? Right. Right? Meaning that it was something that was done in a positive light. I remember hearing Manifest Destiny in, I want to say high school. I don't think it was middle school. I want to say high school in U.S. history class. And remembering taking that word and being like, oh, that makes sense. That manifest destiny, right? That's why they did what they did, right? It was because of that, right? But then going to college and taking classes and realizing manifest destiny was just a belief that I can take this land because it's supposed to be given to me. I'm supposed to have it, right? And realizing that is wildly nuts. To even think that that is okay. And so the impact on Indigenous nations that both Professor Peterson and Professor Williams talked about, the U.S. military waged war against Indigenous resistance, right, including the Indian War of 19th century, and then the two massacres, the Sand Creek Massacre and the Wounded Knee Massacre, 1864 and 1890. And then what's really important is the Homestead Act, which gave free land, quote unquote free land, to settlers, but that land had already been taken from Indigenous. This was Indigenous land. There was an act that said, you are a settler. You can have this quote unquote free land, right? We know, right? We are learning that that was not free land, right? This was land that belonged to some people, right? And so this, we are going to definitely link these slides so that you can see. But this is only a 3-minute video, but it talks about the Sand Creek Massacre. It talks about what it was. And this is also the Wounded Knee Massacre, right? So if you didn't know what it was, again, we'll link the links to this so that you can go back.
So what are reservations? We've heard that term. We've seen them on maps. The term Indian reservation, even though that word is inaccurate, right? Christopher Columbus, as we all know, thought he was in India when in fact he wasn't, right? And that's where we get that term Indian, which is oftentimes associated with reservation, when the better term is either Aboriginal, Indigenous, or Native. Nonetheless, what are reservations? What is it like there? I would wager not many of us have been. Maybe some have. Has anyone been to, or I see a few hands up. I see a number of hands up. Right? And a few other hands of other students in here. More people than I would expect have been to a reservation experience on the Seminole Reservation. I believe you said in Florida, right? A people group in Florida that, as with all Native groups here, date back thousands and thousands of years on these lands. And so again, thank you for sharing that. It appears a number of folks here have had that experience. So what are they, right? As you touched on, Maya, well, they are small areas of land designated by the U.S. government where displaced Indigenous nations were again forced to live. It wasn't a choice thing, it was a forced thing. Right, as lands were being taken, the government essentially said, here, you can have these lands here and maintain some sense of your culture. Now, contrary to what some people think, some people have the notion of these places must be thriving. They have casinos and money must be flowing in and things must be great there. That is not actually, in fact, the case. There's a lack of resources and a poor infrastructure on these. There are limited economic opportunities as well. There's also high rates of poverty and health disparities. Here's some things anthropologists have observed. They've observed that there's also been a psychological toll that's been taken as a result of, again, the forced displacement and removal from lands onto reservations. There's been this sense of a forced dependency on the government, where these peoples were self-sufficient. There's been this sense of being forced to depend on the U.S. government, and that's led to identity loss, it's led to stress, it's led to depression, and it's also led to the breakdown of kinship systems. Kinship is a key word, it's a buzzword in anthropology. It basically speaks to this sense of connectedness, this sense of community that exists between people who are not only blood related, but people who are affiliated, whether it be in the native sense, as it relates to many native cultures, through tribal connection, right? And so there's this sense of kinship where oftentimes individuals will introduce themselves by their tribe or by their clan when meeting each other, and individuals of the same one, there's a sense of connection. And with that comes a knowledge of what role to play in the community and just this sense of shared well-being that comes with that. But with the displacement and the removal that took place, that was broken down in a sense. That was broken down in a sense when you're, again, removed from a land with meaning in a forced, violent way, and you're placed on lands that really have minimal significance to you. But anthropologists are seeing that despite this, there is persistence that's being demonstrated. Many communities have revitalized languages, ceremonies, and cultural education. There's been adaptations made, which have allowed for the maintenance of cultural identity. Powwows still exist. I had the privilege of going to a powwow when I was a student at UC Santa Barbara. Went to a powwow. UC Santa Barbara is located on Chumash lands. And it was a very enriching experience for me, even as someone who is not personally Native American ethnically speaking. Just having an interest in culture in general was very enriching to see individuals who have experienced all of this, the displacement, the forced removal, the erosion of culture, still persisting, finding a way to have joy and keep culture alive, if you will. But it's not an easy thing to do given what's happened historically. And again, given the lack of resources, the limited economic opportunity, and the high rates of poverty. But we are seeing, again, in a number of contexts, people finding ways to maintain their culture and to resist, right, in the fashion that I personally, again, witnessed on the Chumash lands through events such as powwows, potlatches, and things of that nature.
Kill the Indian, save the man. I hope that makes you cringe. Hope that makes you feel awful. So we're talking about different ways that Indigenous people have been displaced, right? As I said, and we've all been saying, they didn't own the land in the same way that America comes in and owns the land later on, right? Another thing I want you to consider is like when with colonization, it's one thing to say like, that's my territory over there, don't take it. You might be able to have some military forts and be like, get out. The thing that really, going back to your original question, is like, how do you take possession of something? What does ownership mean? Once you populate the area with your people, then you have full possession over it, right? And so we see the different ways that this is happening historically. Literally, there's killings, right? You have wars, you have disease, you have true genocide. What ends up happening though is that you still end up with a lot of Indigenous people in what becomes the United States. So Richard Henry Pratt comes up with this new idea. So kill the Indian, save the man is this new idea that, and I'll talk about Richard Henry Pratt in a minute. It's this new idea that, okay, we have this population of people, but they're in the way. So we do things like the Homestead Act, where again, we're giving land to white Americans to take over. The Dawes Act that Professor Williams talked about. The other thing that does is it disrupts the hierarchies, as he was talking about kinships, gender norms, and like the way that they interact with each other. This is going to start to, the Dawes Act, where you're going to have private property, is going to start to impose these ideas of private property. So instead of kinship and helping each other out, now you just have to worry about your property and your family. The definition of family starts to change. Where we were thinking of community, we're thinking of kinship. Now we're thinking about the family as the father, the mother, and the children. It disrupts and it weakens the tribes. So again, you have the literal killing of people, but then you have the weakening through these different other things. So we have kill the Indian, save the man is this idea that Richard Henry Pratt came up with. Can we go to the next slide? Richard Henry Pratt was a army general, and he fought in the Civil War, and then later on, he also was in charge of war prisoners. He was in Florida, and he started experimenting with these ideas of assimilation with Indigenous war prisoners. And basically what he was trying to do is to change them, going back to these ideas of erasure, erasing their culture, their identity, who they were, and this idea that we can assimilate Indigenous people to act and behave and to be American. So basically strip them away of their spiritual beliefs, strip them away of the way that they understood life to be, their sustenance patterns, their language. They're not allowed to speak their language anymore. They're not allowed to, do any of their traditional dances or ceremonies and so forth. And basically, you're going to impose white American culture upon them. The other thing that Professor Hampton was talking about is with manifest destiny, it's the God-given right. So you have to understand, this is like, I really want you to start to think about these things. This is the idea that like the folks who are doing this, the white Americans who are doing this, they believe they're doing the right thing. They're helping these people. These people don't know how to help themselves. These people haven't been living life right. These people haven't been using the resources correctly. So we're here to save them, right? What they really wanted was the land and the power and the control. But you have another large population who actually believes we're doing the right thing as good, proper Christians. And not to say anything bad about the Christian faith, but you have to understand that Christianity and the things that are happening there were used as justification for some of the horrific things that were going on. So with Henry Pratt, he develops the Carlisle Indian School, and this is the boarding school system. And basically, indigenous children are forcibly taken from their families and placed in these boarding schools between the 19th and the 20th century. Yes, the 20th century. I know, like, for some of us, it's like, I was born in the 1900s. That's recent. The 19th and 20th century, there's over 500 of these schools that are developed here in the United States. And I'm just talking about the United States because they have them in Canada too. So they forcibly remove children from their families and put them in these schools where, again, they're not allowed to speak their language. They're not allowed to practice any of their traditional customs and norms. They have to then adopt Christianity, right? And this was another way. So going back to that quote of kill the Indian, save the man, is for the people that are left behind that haven't literally been killed, is that you strip them away from everything that they are. You impose a new identity on them. But you have to also remember that they're never going to be fully accepted as white Americans in the way that white Americans are. So just like we're talking about with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where now you have a population of people who are the outsiders, these folks who have been here generations, thousands of years are now outsiders. And they've been weakened with these schools. So this goes on for a long, long time. Some like really tragic things happen. A lot of these schools, the way that the assimilation occurs is through violence. Again, so if you are caught speaking your native language, you are beaten, right? You are punished. It's very punitive. And then you have to understand how difficult it must have been for children, first of all, any child to be taken from their parents and placed somewhere where they don't have the protection of their families. And then to immediately, you're stripped from your traditional clothing, you're put into American Western style, your hair is cut. So traumatic, because for a lot of tribes, the hair was sacred. And now you have these ideas that your hair is sacred, and these folks are taking you in and cutting your hair off, right? But the idea, when other Americans were looking at this, it was like such an example of like how wonderful, look at what we can do here. And again, going back to stolen land, this is how, again, they are weakened and then land can be taken. I think that's what I have for that.
And this is an example, right? This is the Carlisle Indian. This is the school. There's several documentaries that have been created that talk about the missing children. So we know that children were taken from their families. There were also so many children that never went back home. Right? They never got to see their family. And so there's several documentaries that follow more. I think it's a great video. I think these photos are powerful. Right? The side photos. I think they took these photos, right, to say how great, right? It's how great of what we've done, right? But it just shows like the destruction of taking people, taking children from what they know, right? To this monolithic type look, right? And that one of the roots did. That a lot of the plaques, those weren't there. There were several children that were killed and left there. None of the information.
Can I add one more thing to that? One more thing to that is like with history, my students are like, oh, she always says this probably. But with history, the other thing we want you to consider, right, is that it's not so neat that so a thing where it's like, okay, but that ended. It ended here and it's over. These things continue. So basically what takes over the boarding school system is adoption. And so you're going to have a long period into the 20th century, even into the 1960s and 70s, where white families are adopting indigenous kids, but these are kids who have their parents. But you'll have child protective services and other agencies that come in and who say these kids are, they're living in a dangerous environment. Goes back to the culture. Sometimes you'll have a family that's extended family or generations of grandparents are there, aunts are there, and they say the house is too crowded. So they would find reasons to take children from the families and have white Americans adopt them when they had both parents who wanted their children. So this kind of stuff goes on. And this is what we're hoping that you understand is that you don't just say, cool, but we fixed it, right? We don't have that anymore and we're better now. No, it's like you have to then consider how do things then manifest differently from that point forward, right?
Thanks for that. Additional context. Who's welcome and who's excluded. What to keep in mind is that the United States, as we know it today, is not something that Native people asked for to come here, right? This is not a form of government that was or sought after. It's here because, as we talked about, disease, weaponry, things of that nature made it possible for settlers to colonize these lands. So the U.S. is a settler colonial state. Unlike traditional nations, the U.S. was built on land theft. It was built on the erasure of indigenous. What reinforced this, again, it was weaponry, it was disease, it was things of that nature that allowed for it to begin. But what reinforced it were laws. One such law is the Naturalization Act of 1790. White people. If you weren't white, you could not be a citizen. Created a racialized construct of citizenship. The definition of whiteness was also different at that time. People who would now be considered white, people from places such as Italy, would not be considered white at that time. There was actually a much smaller, much more narrow, at that time, definition of what whiteness even is. Another discussion for another time, but it is interesting to actually look into how whiteness has morphed from that time into now, being very small and consisting of a very small people, mainly individuals from the British Isles and that region who came here as colonists, to now encompassing pretty much anyone of European descent, ending even more so. That in mind, as we talk about, you had to be white to be a citizen, had to be white in a different sense than we know it now, in much more particular. Anyways, there was also the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. What that did is it restricted while European settlers were welcome. So who was welcome and who was excluded? European immigrants, they were encouraged to settle, while indigenous and non-white people faced barriers. There was essentially a hierarchy at that time, right? If you were native, if you were black, you weren't a citizen at all with anybody. If you were white, again by that more narrow definition, right, you had the law backing you up. That was how things were structured at that time. Three, it was known. It was something that was not only known in terms of perception, but it was also something that was known in terms of there was a legal backing, and these things were codified at that time. That's history. With that being the case, people who had lived on these lands thousands and upon thousands of years now found themselves second-class citizens without any laws, without any legal in their own homelands. That is a dynamic that at that time. So what's important to keep in mind as we talk about this, who is welcome, that as a result of this, Native people, not even just Native people to this day experience. I read a fascinating book in graduate school called Indigenous Methodologies, written by this Native scholar. She's a doctoral student. He writes about, even though things, laws have changed, Naturalization Act of 1790 isn't in force right now, but she wrote about how she still, even in academia, feels this sense of native ways of knowing. And it depends on the specific tribe and people group. I don't want to generalize all peoples into one bucket, but in general, good ways of knowing are different than Western ways of knowing in terms of science, in terms of things that we take for granted, how certain principles of science might operate. Well, you're different. And so she felt in graduate school, working on her PhD, had to basically forsake her ways of understanding the world as passed down from her grandparents and their grandparents, and in order essentially to obtain that degree, in order to advance, in order to progress. It was a sense of exclusion, felt of I can't hold to my native traditions, case they won't be respected. And so she writes this very fascinating book as she's wrestling with how certain things she's taught about certain properties, ways of understanding the world are different. She's learning about in her studies. So even to this day, in more subtle and more nuanced ways, there's still this sense of exclusion that exists for Native people.
I'm going to add a few things on there. I have. So we have to remember, right? Like with these things, basically, like this nation is built on stolen land. It's built through enslaved labor, and it's maintained through borders and immigration policies. It's harsh, right? It's like, no, don't tell me that it's harsh. It's too harsh, but it's fact. We also have great values, these ideas of inalienable rights, these ideas of freedoms and liberties. And I think one of the things that I really have a lot of hope for, because I am still hopeful, is that we kind of align more with all the things that we say that we stand on, right? That we are about inalienable rights, about rights for everybody. So the Naturalization Act of 1790, remember that's going back to 1790, right? This didn't control who could be where. It wasn't controlling borders in that way. It was more about, as Professor Williams is saying, it's about defining who is and who is not a citizen. That means who has rights and who does not have rights. The Chinese Exclusion Act, the reason why this was created is because we have a large influx of immigrants coming in from China who are laborers. They're here building railroads. They're here doing all sorts of things, right? So consider what it means when we can use the labor of people. You can think about that too with the Bracero programs and also other histories with the Mexican border and Mexican population. When we need labor, when we need people to be working here, but when do we exclude them? And not only that, when we want them here for labor, when it's benefiting us, but that they don't get full rights, you know? And so again, this is all, again, we're talking about the hierarchies that it creates and the racialized idea of who can actually be American citizen and who cannot be an American citizen. I think that's what I have for that one too.
I'm not even talking about anything. Very clear. Indigenous folks resisted. Yeah. They did not just say, okay, never. I love that you're kind of Indian. Because this is the point that's always left out. Right? Just let it happen. Just let it be taken away. Right? But this is just a few examples of movement. We are people that you're not people who are just going to allow it. So the Peloton Confederacy, which is now known as Virginia, led to the first Anglo Peloton War, War, which is now known as Connecticut, and the King Philip's War, which is one of the most significant uprisings. Another thing to say is the occupation of Alcatraz, right? Activists occupied the abandoned prison to demand Indigenous life. Here, right? Under the American Indian movement fought for Indigenous sovereignty and just sovereignty. Our efforts to reclaim stolen land. We know that the land back movement speaks to return land to Indigenous. A perfect example of that is South Dakota, Dakota Nation. But that's what I want you to remember. I want you to think about anytime you're about Indigenous. And they are still here, right? Like we think, and sometimes, right? They are here. A lot of people have Indigenous blood in them. Don't even know it. So thinking about resisting, thinking about folks are still here. I want you to leave on that note. Recap, right? The main recap is an Indigenous presence at colonization, right? But that there was presence. People were here, right? Before colonization. Any settlers came. holding it for thousands of years.
The process of land theft and forced displacement. We hope that you've taken away from this talk an understanding of how this happened, right? How this land was obtained and what the effects were of this forced displacement on the psyche, on the cultural framework, and on many other aspects of the lives of Native peoples who experienced this. And also the impact of U.S. policies on Indigenous communities, the impact that these policies had on communities, and what the persistence of that impact has been even up until now.
Yeah, and how can we challenge the myth of immigration on stolen land? So again, some of the questions and some of the things that brought up, I think that some of the things that came up, some of you were like, I hadn't heard of that, or I heard of the thing, but I don't remember what it is. Again, the discussions on immigration at this point, it's like you can't have those discussions if you don't know the history of how all of these things developed in the first place. And as we were saying, like, we're scratching the surface with a lot of this stuff. So as I said at the beginning, if you have a lot of questions and you're like, but I need to know more about this, and they didn't talk about that. Yeah, so go read, figure it out, because it's really, really important for us to understand that history in order to have the discussions of things like immigration today, right?
Question we want you all to reflect on. What does it mean to acknowledge stolen land?
How does the narrative of immigration shift when we acknowledge the land's original inhabitants?
And what steps can individuals take toward justice for Indigenous peoples?
Some research